And what inevitably happens is other companies have seen they can make money off this. Human performance is getting bigger. This is now very lucrative, et cetera, et cetera. And so a lot of different companies now swarm to this new contract. And how do they win? Well, they start to say they can do it for cheaper than the other guy. And so what ends up happening, and why I think we chose this clickbaity inflammatory title of why contracting is killing strength and conditioning, is you have this race to the bottom. Hey team, welcome back to another week of the Mops and Mo's podcast with Drew and Alex. No guests today, just the two of us, just sitting here on a lovely Sunday. No,
It's not Sunday.
it's Saturday. Sunday. Anyway, you were at TSEC this week. How was it?
I spent most of it sad that I got stood up by the co-host for my presentation. It was supposed to be two of us. I
That was
submitted for
me.
two of us,
That was me.
and then I presented all alone.
Well, so okay, it sounds like people were asking. For folks that don't know, I had a trip to Scotland planned, golf trip with a friend of mine, and it got moved. It was supposed to be several weeks back. It got moved to last week. I guess a week prior. So yeah, it was like a week before TSEC. And I got home 3 days before, 2 days before. And had the trip not been moved, I would have been there with you. But
To be fair to Drew, he and like yes, he got home like 3 days before TSEC, so theoretically he could have just bounced over to TSEC and been there. But Drew does have other things going on in his life, and he is a dad, and it
yeah,
is a respectable decision to prioritize dad things over TSEC.
as much as I love my profession.
But
So
it was
anyway,
sad. One
that's why I
day,
wasn't there. That's why I wasn't there.
since I have known Drew, not even just like since we've been working together, since I have known Drew, he has not made an appearance at any conferences that I'm
Yeah, I
going.
also hate conferences.
Yeah. So maybe it's all coincidence that his golf trip got moved.
I did it
Before
on I
before we
did it
keep
on
talking about
purpose.
TSAC, I got a question for you. Because like I know a little bit of this, but the audience doesn't know, and some people might be golf nerds. Where'd you go on your trip? What was that like?
Went to Scotland, went to the west coast of Scotland. For folks that are somewhat familiar, you have the kind of inner Hebrides and the outer Hebrides. The inner Hebrides is the chain of islands right off the west coast, and then the outer one is beyond that. And so I used to live in Scotland. I've been back a ton of times. 2 trips ago, I took a camper van around and did stone lifting and realized that the camper van move is like the best way to see the country. They have a right to roam law, which means there's virtually no private property. So you can literally camp wherever you want, which is kind of cool.
Isn't there a word for like just wandering across the countryside?
Homelessness?
No, there's a fancy European term they use because
It's called,
a
it's,
lot of European countries have the right to roam stuff.
yeah, it's called, oh my God, the word escapes me. I know exactly what you're talking about. While
I'll
you're
do a
looking
little
that up,
research.
I'll answer your question directly. So, we threw our golf clubs in the back of a Volkswagen camper and we went west for a week and played, uh, Iona, Isla, Mole of Kintyre, all that stuff. So super cool. Played really well. Happy about that. Um, and missed TSEC. I got stuck coming back. I got stuck in Newark. I know that the TSEC folks had some tough travel experiences with weather. I experienced the front end of that coming back. I got stuck in Newark for 8 hours. So I was awake for about 24 hours, which sucked. But anyway, did you find the word?
I did a little Googling, found a bunch of different results. The like accepted thing is every man's right. It's the general public's right to access certain public or privately owned land. So like in certain cases, it allows you to just like wander across people's personal property.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of like finding the word for roaming, I found a bunch of different ones depending on the language and stuff. The French call it flâner. There's different words. There's one that I was thinking of. Maybe it's like a German one that I'm not finding right now.
Rambling is so there's rambling and hill walking,
Hill walking, I've heard, but there's
fell walking.
I don't know.
They love walking. Big walking culture out there.
Yeah.
Scotland's great for it. If folks haven't been, you should go. Very easy flight from the East Coast. So,
Didn't you
um,
have to take like a flight to some sort of drive or train ride to a ferry to another vehicle?
well, that's the nature of island hopping is ferries are typically involved. I'll tell you that every time I'm over in the UK and Europe, quite frankly, just the they'll tell you their public transport's not great. I mean, it blows the United States out of the water. You could get around without a vehicle easily. Not in this country. So,
Okay.
but yeah, we took ferries, took I don't think we took any trains because we had our camper. So it was good.
Nice.
Hmm.
On the returning to the TSAC thing,
Hold on, we should quickly preface for folks that don't know TSAC that we keep saying TSAC. It's tactile
yeah.
strength and conditioning.
And
Uh,
technically, that's not what it's called. Even though
Technically, it's not
everybody
what it's
refers
called.
to it as TSAC,
They
it's the
changed the name.
NSCA's Tactical Annual Training.
Right. And
And
so
and for
this is
those
the
not
annual
in the
conference.
know, for those not in the know, the reason it's called Tactical Annual Training is to avoid the word conference.
Well,
Because in DoD travel, once the word conference is involved, it's a whole
hmm
pain in the butt to do the right paperwork.
yeah.
Um,
So
Now, if we're being sticklers, it doesn't matter what the name of the event is called if it still meets the determination that it's a conference. But you can play whatever games you decide to play in your little space, getting your DTS approved.
yeah. So anyway, you were saying, how was it?
Oh, it was great. It's always a good time. A little bit of reunion. Everybody gets to see everybody they know, all those things. But one theme stood out to me, and it's something you and I have talked about. I don't know if it's something we've talked about on the podcast. There's decent representation at it of actual law enforcement professionals and actual firefighters and things like that. I don't think there is nearly the representation there should be from actual military folks. The only military folks that go to it are the ones whose job in the military is specifically managing programs that are human performance. There aren't really
Like soldiers aren't
operational
there?
commanders, decision makers, things like
Mm.
that. There aren't really just like random soldiers. Like, and I get it, it's an industry conference. Like random soldiers aren't going to go to industry conferences, but it'd be cool to see people in the room who are the recipients of the service also influencing the conversation, not just the providers of the service.
Do you think that should be like a separate thing though?
Maybe.
Because I agree with you. But and this is somebody speaking from having not gone to TSAC, but like from afar, it just seems like a bunch of people talking about tactical foam rolling and agility drills. And I
That I
don't,
mean that's a part of it. There were
right.
for sure
So I'm
those
with you.
things.
I think you get rid of that and you make it an actual like practical thing, then you might see some value add for senior leaders.
And I will say the reason I was been thinking about it today is because yesterday when I was back at actual work after the conference, had a conversation with one of the service members we work with in my current day job role, and she kind of serves as an extender for us. And this is a forthcoming episode about extenders and things like that. But she had mentioned how she wished she could have gone to the conference, and I think it would have been cool. Like I'm gonna try next year to like identify a couple people that we support across our installation and just bring them with us. Like, hey, this isn't your full-time job. You're not going to like necessarily benefit from the CEUs, although in some cases these folks have certifications of their own. But I want to bring you just so you can see what the industry's talking about and see what if what the industry's talking about has anything to do with what you're actually looking for from these programs.
I think there's goodness in that.
Yeah. I think
So,
we talked a long time ago about trying to like give a presentation at TSAC that was more of a panel type thing where we like
mhm.
had a couple uniform folks up there with us. I still think that's on the back
Didn't we
burner or
get
something I'd like to do.
didn't we get shut down?
I mean, yeah, but I think it was probably my fault for the way I submitted it. I think I could have articulated it in a way like
Yeah,
I think I could submit again and articulate it in a way that might get accepted. Yeah.
more to follow. So today, uh, somewhat of maybe an inflammatory topic.
Probably it was a
Um,
topic that was certainly discussed plenty at TSAC.
yeah. So here's some background. What we're going to talk about today is, and if you've seen the title, you'll know this, but is contracting killing strength and conditioning? It's intentionally a little bit hyperbolic.
We would never clickbait
No,
people
never
into
clickbait
listening.
people. You and I both, I think, have people that reach out to us a lot of times and sort of tell us their story. And
I
so,
will say this is a nice bridge between talking about TSAC and talking about this topic. I do know people who follow will know I did a post a while back comparing the salaries of contract strength and conditioning coaches in the tactical setting to the salaries of actual service members and to the salaries of various hourly rate workers, fast food, grocery stores, mechanics, whoever. It didn't look that great. And I don't know who the person is. Apparently somebody showed up to like a contractor meeting that was happening on the side at TSAC and
yep.
just like screamed about that post and then walked out. Um, Probably not the
I've-
best way to handle it.
I think that post has been used more than once
No, I think it's been used quite a bit.
from
And
what I've
you
heard.
you told me that like people at work came up to you and were
Yeah,
surprised to learn what the coaches were or were
yeah.
not paid for the services they were providing. So that was it, I think it serves as a good conversation starter.
Right. And that's why we've decided to have this conversation because, like I was saying, people have messaged me, people have messaged you. Like, we all have friends in this industry that have gone through, especially contracting, like contracts changing over, people taking massive pay cuts, people losing their jobs because the government changes their mind. Like, and so this is one of those episodes where we're sort of workshopping it as we go, but we've got enough down here to, I think, start the conversation. Maybe it becomes something bigger, who knows? But basically, the foundational point we're trying to make here is that while although the tactical space is arguably the like fastest growing sector of strength and conditioning, there's a whole heap of risk in terms of how it is being set up and how it's being run from a contractual standpoint that makes you just kind of ask this question of whether or not it's sustainable and are we basically shooting ourselves in the face with the way that it's being it's being managed. So did that, I mean, does that set the
I
tone?
think I think it sets the tone pretty well. I think I do kind of upfront in this one because I know certain people will be listening to this podcast. Some of those people like run these contracting companies or write these contracts and things like that. And I kind of want to this might ruin the clickbaitiness of the whole thing, but I kind of want to say up front, it's definitely a stretch to say it's ruining strength and conditioning. Like I think it is
We didn't say
probably pretty
ruining, we're
clear.
saying killing,
I don't think it's killing it either. I think it's pretty
wounding.
easy to say. So if we chart this whole thing, I don't know what we would point to as the first tactical strength and conditioning job. I'd have to dig further into the history to find like who got a role for the first time.
POTUS was
Um,
the
but there had to be somebody doing it for POTIF to get launched. So like POTIF might be the first big thing, but you know what I mean.
Mhm.
I don't know who the first tactical coach was. Who I don't know who can claim that title or anything like that. What I do know is NSCA started having tactical training in 2012. So like a little more than 10 years ago at this point. And I think it's conclusive that regardless of the challenges we're facing today, the industry is in a significantly better place today than it was 10 years ago. There are more jobs, there's more opportunities, there's more leadership positions. It is growing, and in some cases, it's growing faster than I think is sustainable. There's some really cool developments going on. Um, yeah, I think those are all important things. And just as a funny one, I was Googling to find exactly how old it was, and I found a page that had a little bit of the history. And the page that has a little bit of the history has like four pictures on it. And out of the four pictures, I see four people that I have personally worked with very closely. So the community is definitely not that big.
small world. It's a very small community. It's getting bigger, which is good.
I'll make
But
that five if I scroll down the page.
so do you want to explain
Oh my God, if I
should,
keep scrolling down the page, it's like 10 people I know
sh
personally.
should we start with just explaining the nature of contracting, non-personal services, personal services?
Yeah. Is are you telling me to explain that? Because
Well,
I can
you
do my
know more.
best.
I think you know more about it than I do. I know what it feels like
And
on the
that's saying
ground.
something. So you've been a
I've
contractor,
been a
you've
contractor.
experienced
Yeah,
it.
I should
Yeah.
preface this. I started my career as a contractor. I got a contract position right out of graduate school. I think most people that listen know this, but strength and conditioning, Air Force Special Operations, contract gig, all of that. But the thing that I think was unique about that period of time is that the contract company was smaller and owned a smaller number of contracts, and so it was much more of a personal relation. Like it felt like I was getting hired into a company, and I had like some voice and some ability to negotiate some of that stuff. Whereas now, and we'll probably get into this, you're starting to see like mega contracts with
Mhm.
hundreds and hundreds of people and primes and sub like there's layers of stuff now, and I think that contributes a lot to some of the gripes that we're gonna bring up. So
Yeah.
that yeah, so I can speak to kind of the ground level, but personal services versus non-personal services.
I think before I even do the personal versus non-personal services part, there's a bunch of layers to this one. And I'm going to admit now that I am not an expert on contracting.
What?
I have spent time in the same room as people who are kind of experts in contracting, but I'm not one of them. I've gleaned a little bit of relevant knowledge from them, just having conversations, but I have bluntly actively avoided being too
Mm,
involved in contracting because it seems like a pain for some of the reasons we're about to discuss. Um, yeah, and kind of the reason we're doing this with no guest right now, I think we would love in the future to have extensions of this conversation with people who are more of experts in the space, but many of them are in positions where they could not come in and have a candid conversation about it. It would put their careers at risk and things like that. Um, Frustrating, but understandable. So, what are the things people need to know at a superficial level? One, as you pointed out, is the personal services versus non-personal services thing. This gets fuzzy, right? So personal services contracts are in a gray area where the government is hiring contractors. Well, they're hiring companies to hire people to provide a service that by its nature should probably be provided by somebody who's either in uniform or a government civilian. It like that's the whole thing. Like if you go look up the contracting law around personal services, there's all these warnings because people in those contracts are going to look to service members as though they are government employees. The way they're going to behave, the functions they perform, the way they fit into chains of supervision and stuff, they might come off as looking like government employees even though they aren't. Now, we still do it because there's a bunch of laws that constrain hiring and things like that. It's very hard to create additional active duty uniform billets. Those have to come from somewhere. You're either growing the total force, which is very, very hard to do. Congress has to approve that, or you're taking those positions away from some other program that's shrinking. Same goes for government civilians. You're either growing the total civilian workforce or you're taking those positions from somewhere else, and it's going to be a fight for resources. So that's why we end up doing some personal services contracts, but you can only do that when an exception is in place. Like the most common exceptions that I'm aware of are medical and special operations. So like hospitals can do certain things with personal services that the rest of the force couldn't, and the special operations community can do things with personal services that other organizations couldn't. Notably, in the last few years, human performance has expanded dramatically outside of special operations, and conventional military does not have that personal services exemption that SOCOM does. That creates a bunch of problems. I've ranted for a little bit. Have I answered? Whether the reality is when you're not non-personal, if you're non-personal services, you don't fall into one of those exceptions. You should not be taking instruction from a government employee. You should be receiving your instructions from your management at the company. You are providing a service. You don't work for the government. You work for your company and you provide a service on behalf of that company. And the government has no say in who gets hired to fulfill it. They're receiving a service. They're
mhm.
not receiving people. They don't own those people, so they don't get part of that. If it's personal services, the government does get a say in who the people are.
Beautiful. I think to like just put a bow on it, because I Googled this and it makes a lot of sense. Personal services contracts create an employer-employee relationship. So it's
Yes.
it's it's very, very similar to your run-of-the-mill government civilian with some
Mm-hmm.
differences, obviously, but like
You
that's
just
effect.
paycheck comes from a different place,
Yep.
but
Yep.
in many other ways, you act like you work for the government.
Versus the non-personal services contract, which is, I don't even know the percentage here. I'm assuming it's going to be the majority
Mm-hmm.
of contracts that the government has, where you, like you mentioned, the government hires a company to fulfill a role. And so that company provides people or vehicles or copy machines or
Yeah.
basketballs. I mean, I don't know, I'm grasping now, but like the
No, I
gist of
can
it
I can
is,
provide some examples that help illustrate it better, I think, too, is
well, I don't
that
think we need to hang out on it for too long, but go for
no,
it.
but people understand why human performance makes this fuzzy.
Hmm.
Because like some of the more common contracts you'll run into if you're in like a run-of-the-mill military job, the ones I ran into most commonly were like the guys who did like one tier higher maintenance on vehicles and weapons. Like if a service member
Hmm.
couldn't fix it, like we had strike guys that fixed our strikers were around the footprint a little bit. They would pop in and check with me and make sure our vehicles were good to go and we didn't need anything. But they definitely didn't work for us. They just like provided a very obvious service. There's some like IT contractors that do that stuff. Boss IT, I can't remember what that whole acronym stands for, but it's like IT as a service, so you can contract it out and not use uniformed people. Just like if you like run into some like Raytheon and Lockheed contractors and guys, they would just like do very clear technical tasks where you could just say yes, they did it or no, they didn't do it. It wasn't this
Hmm.
ongoing, how do we evolve this service? How do we like sell it and things like that? All that is unique to human performance.
Right. And I think one of the big issues people have is that most of, I'll use H2F as the example, but most, if not all of those contracts are non-personal services contracts,
Correct.
which
On
means
the coaching side for sure.
on the coaching side. So like you said, you can't choose who's on your team. They technically don't work for you, although there is language in there that kind of defaults them under the guidance of the brigade commander at some level. But it constrains the relationship between
Mhm.
the team and the coaches, which then complicates in some sense the relationship between the coaches and the athletes
Well,
or
I'll
the
ask you,
soldiers.
because you probably have a better handle on this part of it. It seems, from my vantage point on this whole thing, that a large amount of the success happening, and I'm speaking specifically to H2F now, but I think this applies to basically any conventional human performance program that employs coaches in a non-personal services status. Um, it seems like a lot of the biggest successes are coming from coaches who are going beyond what their performance work statement says
Hmm.
and starting to behave as though there is an employer-employee relationship.
Yes, I think yes. So performance of work statement would basically be
And
here's
I'm
what you
not
can and
criticizing
can.
those people.
No, I'm not either.
Yeah.
But the performance of work statement, just for people that don't know, tells contractors what they can and can't do. It's like your job description. And getting into the legalness of this, technically, they cannot do anything that's not in their job description.
Mm-hmm.
And I think probably in a lot of contractual situations, that's a good thing. But like you mentioned in this human performance space, a lot of the successes that interestingly senior leaders seem to go on and on about have come directly from contractors going outside the scope of their contract because typically they're just good people and they recognize that in order to create relationships, build programs, like create compliance, all of these things, in order to do that, you kind of have to go outside the very, very strict language in the contract. And the flip side of that is we've seen a lot of situations, especially in the earlier days of programs like H2F, where programs get off to a really bad start because contractors, certain types of contractors will say, I'm not going to do XYZ because it's not in my contract, whatever XYZ might be. And that, for hopefully pretty obvious reasons, can create some tension amongst a team.
I don't know exactly how to handle this one without getting in trouble. I will say that like people outside it shouldn't have access to the PWS. I will say a little bit of Googling, you might find some PDFs on the internet. But to use a fully open source thing, it's easy to look up these jobs on Indeed and say what it says their job is. And it describes things like develop, implement, and oversee a comprehensive periodized education and services program integrated and synchronized with. So like some of the language you can like stretch to like
Very
get them to
gray.
do
It's very
things.
gray. Yeah.
Yeah, it says strength coaches will perform services in accordance with the NSCA as a certified strength and conditioning specialist. Like scope of practice stuff. Again, sure. Like the NSA will describe coaches doing a lot of things.
Do you think if all of the coaches unanimously across the board decided to not go above and beyond their contracts, tactical human performance would collapse?
It'd be in a way worse place than it is. I don't know about collapse. Because I think the worst, like part of the most frustrating thing here is that I think this might have gotten better since the beginning of the rollout of all this stuff. But I think a lot of them were communicated during their hiring process that they were going to come in and we were basically going to like hand them a clipboard and a whistle and a stopwatch and they were going to walk into a
A gym.
fully outfitted strength and conditioning facility, and they were going to run companies through like their football players, and
Hmm.
they're just going to follow the program they built. And I think they pretty quickly realized that that is not what's happening here. And tactical is different than collegiate. It's not like that. And they had to pretty quickly start adapting what they do and how they do it.
Hmm.
Um, I know I was guilty of this. Like a lot of coaches listening to this probably met me when I was rolling around the army, having these conversations with coaches who were very jaded about how they'd been lied to in the process of coming on board. And we talked a lot about how there were some really, really important things they were providing. And many of those things we described are not in their PWS. Like we talk about how they are like the sensor that can help refer them to all these medical professionals. We
Hmm.
talk about like the role they play in identifying like behavioral health stuff or like modifying pro like there's there's a ton of things that they do that is not aren't clearly stated. And you could, I mean, when you read the language, like develop, implement, and oversee a comprehensive program that includes education. Like you, yeah, maybe you can just like say it does, but if the language is that fuzzy, we really don't know. I don't think the PWS holds them to a very clear standard.
No, I would agree with that. And because of that, and we're sort of jumping ahead, we can come back to it, but I think that vagueness is reflected in poor pay.
Sure. And the pay issue is one of the elephants in the room. I think before we before we can really dive into
Yeah,
pay,
we don't have to go there yet. I just mentioned it.
no, it's relevant and we got to talk about it in this conversation. But I think one to clarify, whenever people talk about like military grade or contracting and things like that, the term that comes up is lowest bidder. And there are situations where the guidance is lowest bidder. This human performance space is not one of them. The guiding framework that's relevant here is least price technically acceptable, LPTA. And that's what brings us back to the problem with the vagueness is if what's expected of them is kind of vague and hard to quantify or hard to state objectively, then it's hard to say what technically acceptable means. And there are some ways you can do this. The ways that people will be familiar with from the listings on Indeed and things like that are that these jobs require a certain number of years of experience. Experience is defined a certain way, and they require certain certifications. But everybody here knows that you can have a certification and not necessarily be competent or effective. You can have certain experience that doesn't necessarily carry over. Some people perform at a really high level after only a little bit of experience. Some people have a ton of experience and still struggle to perform at that level. It's just really, really hard to set clear, objective, enforceable standards for what technically acceptable means. And I do not blame the people running the companies hiring the coaches. I do not blame the government writing the contract because a lot of these issues are kind of in the overlap where communication between those parties is hard. And I don't really know what the
Do you
answer is
not
here.
blame I mean, see, as you're saying that, and when you first brought this up pre-recording, I agreed with you. But then we won't name company names. Well, I should say we will try not to name company names, contract company names. I blame the contracting companies a little bit.
I think there is a little bit of blame in a lot of different places.
Who's the most to blame? If you had this is pretty morbid, but
It's hard for me to answer this question without like
if you had a
revealing
lineup,
knowledge that I
who would
have
you
unique
shoot?
personal access to.
Yeah, no, I know.
I think the real solution to this problem is not, frankly, blame. The real solution to this problem is to acknowledge, or at least I think for the most part, everybody involved wants this whole thing to get better. But to make it better, those people have to come to the table and have some hard conversations about what steps are going to be required to achieve that. When I say I don't blame them, I think a little bit of blame is fair in a bunch of different places.
I think I
I think
do
the
blame
contract could be
them.
better written, and I think part of that is
Sure.
lessons learned type of stuff that only comes from doing it. I think on the company's side, and I'm going to do this without making too many enemies. You definitely can't blame the subcontractors.
Well, hold on. Before you go down that road, let's explain this really quickly. I'll give kind of the brief overview. And I know we've done this. I think we
Mhm.
talked about this in our how to become a tactical strength coach episode, so I won't belabor it. But effectively, the way that this works, right, is that the government, in this case, we use the Army, says they want a thing. Let's say they want strength coaches. They then put that out to industry, and then industry, and that's what we keep referring to when we say companies, they bid on that and they say we can do that for this dollar value.
Mhm.
And you mentioned least price technically acceptable. That is, to be clear, that is not what is happening in tactical human performance. What's happening in tactical human performance is lowest bidder is winning. And so basically, like if Drew
Well,
Incorporated and
I would revise that statement a little bit. I would say that when technically acceptable is poorly defined,
right, that's fair.
yeah,
But the point is that if Drew Incorporated said, I can provide you this service for 100 million, and Alex Incorporated says, I can provide this service for 103 million, and then Asshole Incorporated says, I'll do it for 20 bucks. The government is like, oh shit, those guys can do it for 20 bucks. Let's give it to them. So to your point, I kind of blame, as I'm thinking about this, and maybe I change my mind as we're going, but right now, I think the biggest issue is that there's companies that are coming in millions and millions and millions of dollars under what we would consider to be a good number. And then because they're doing that, they then have to meet the demands of the contract, as poorly written as it might be. And who suffers in that? Well, it's the people that they hire. Because it's like
sure,
if you say you can do a thing for $10 million, you have to then do the thing for $10 million. And if you hire several hundred coaches, like the money gets pretty thin pretty quickly. So that's right now I blame contracting companies, I think is where I'm at the most. There's other people to blame,
I
but,
think part of it, I mean, at the root of this is that no one organization has as much power as we think they have.
but do you
Like
not
the people
think,
writing the contract still have to deal with big government acquisitions
sure,
stuff and justify a bunch of things because and frankly, I'm pretty sure this one went through LPTA, but there's like decisions that are made by much higher contracting authorities, and one of those key decisions is the decision to choose between best value or least price technically acceptable. And I guess I'm looking at it on my browser here, and it's actually lowest price technically acceptable. Whatever. Both are source selection processes used by the government, and there's a process through which they decide which one to use. And I'll just quote it here. LPTA is appropriate when requirements are well defined, the risk
mm,
of unsuccessful contract performance is low, and there's no need or willingness to pay for higher quality or performance. And I know that sounds real bad, right? But that's not going to be a decision made by somebody who inherently understands and cares about human performance. It's going to be a decision made by a contracting bureaucrat layers and layers
right.
away and at some other headquarters or whatever. Best value considers factors such as performance and risk. It still aims to select the technically acceptable proposal with the lowest evaluated price, but it has a bunch of other factors that go into consideration surrounding quality and like whether they think it's going to be unsuccessful. And I think this comes back to what we were talking about earlier. It comes back to the challenge of articulating in language that a lawyer would approve, a lawyer who doesn't know anything about human performance, articulating what quality means when it comes to coaching.
And that's where I blame the NSCA. But before I blame the NSCA, I go back to the contracting companies here because, and I should preface this by saying I want to be proven wrong. So if you're out there, and I know some of you that work for these companies, please come on and tell me that I'm wrong. But as I see it, let's say you and I work, and we won't name names, but let's say you and I work for a company and we see the requirements that the government puts out, and we see some of the big boys putting up big take, like it's going to cost us this much. You and I are conniving little assholes, and we're like, hey, I think we can do this for super cheap. But we know that in order to do that, we got to pay people shit money, but we do it anyway. Like that's where I'm like, you guys made a decision. There was a boardroom decision that said, we can do it for half the price of these big guys. How can we do that? Well, let me tell you, we're just going to give people shitty money and they're just going to have to deal with it. That's why I sit here and I'm like, oh man, maybe it's their fault.
I have a hard time arguing against that other than
Watch War Dogs if you don't believe me.
it's sort of the nature of capitalism is like the whole
Sure.
system
Except now we're dealing with
incentivizes
people.
cutting costs. And yes, I know it's dealing with people. I
I mean,
get
that's
it.
what Boeing is dealing with. That's what,
Oh God.
Anyway,
The invisible hand has just as much of a vote in this one as the people in the boardroom that made that decision. I don't know.
yeah, but when you're choosing to bitch slap with your invisible hand and just not pay people enough, like that's kind of a douchey move. Sorry. Like, and again, bless my heart. I preface this by saying, if you know that world better than me and can show me I'm wrong, please tell me. I want to know
Did
that.
did you just bless your heart yourself?
Yeah, I don't know if I can
Is,
do that, but
is that allowed?
it's a North Carolina thing. Downward pay pressure. You want to hit that? Are we there yet?
I mean, you kind of
I kind of
already
just hit it, didn't I?
described it.
So here's the thing, and this I think is the genesis of for me at least to some sense why we have this conversation. Here's what happens is that again, we'll go to the contract example. Like Alex and Drew win the contract and it's a 2 year thing. And so we have the contract for 2 years and we're paying our coaches $75,000. And then after 2 years, it gets put back up for bid. And what inevitably happens is other companies have seen they can make money off this. It's because, human performance is getting bigger. This is now very lucrative, et cetera, et cetera. And so a lot of different companies now swarm to this new contract. And how do they win? Well, they start to say they can do it for cheaper than the other guy. And so what ends up happening and why I think we chose this clickbaity inflammatory title of why contracting is killing strength and conditioning is you have this race to the bottom for salaries. And so whereas before Alex and Drew Incorporated were paying our coaches $75,000, once that 2 years is up, if Douchebags Anonymous comes in and says they can do it for cheaper, they will now pay the coaches $60,000. And those coaches that are in those positions have first right of refusal, which basically means that if you are the incumbent, you have the right to keep that job should you want to. And these companies will come in and they'll say, "Yeah, you can keep your job, but it's going to pay you 20,000 less a year." And that's why I think it's killing strength and conditioning is because there's no mechanism in place for somebody who has been in a position for 5, 10, 15, 20 years
Mhm.
to like have a career basically. I mean, you're stuck and you're at
Yeah,
the whim of the contract company.
I think one of the root cause phenomena behind this, and I referred to this in posts I've done before, is called the passion tax.
Oh
It's
yeah.
you'll hear it talked about in plenty of industries, but it's definitely relevant in this industry. And it's that these are jobs that are pretty cool to a lot of people,
Hmm.
which means there are more people that want to do them than there are opportunities. And we've like anybody who came from the collegiate space or the pro space even probably has experience with the pay in those spaces, the unpaid internships you have to go to, even if you already have advanced degrees, the the suck you have to go through to get one of these positions. And we should, as an industry, work towards a place where that's not the case. People deserve to be paid a living wage, all that kind of stuff. But back to the like invisible hand capitalism stuff, when there are people that will do it for that low price, that low salary, or the no salary in the case of some of these internships, there's not a lot of pressure on the institutions
Hmm.
to change it. We like this is a problem in teaching. This is a problem in like Hollywood for some of those roles. Is a problem in a lot of places. You have people that are willing to suffer or accept lower pay because the status that comes with it, or the cool factor, or the fact that you get to do what you love, is important enough to them to overcome it. That is not a good excuse. And this is what comes back to something Drew cares about a lot: is like who like where in the space are is the advocacy happening to try and fix this?
That's where I blame the NSCA.
Yeah.
So we've talked about this ad infinitum, which is Latin. We've talked about this a lot. I don't know the answer. And again, I'll preface this by saying if somebody who works for the NSCA wants to come on and tell me I'm wrong, please do. I would love to be proven wrong here. But my point is, if you look across other industries, and we were kind of going back and forth about this before we recorded, and we struggled to find a good example, but the medical space kind of comes to mind for me because it's adjacent to what we're doing. and you mentioned Hollywood, and I think that's another good example, maybe if we get into kind of unions. But the issue I see is that the National Strength and Conditioning Association does not advocate for strength coaches. It probably thinks that it does, but really what it does is pimp out research ad infinitum. It does not advocate for salaries. It does salary surveys. Like we've all submitted salary surveys, and that's cool, I guess. It results in like an Instagram post. Great, thanks. But there's no advocacy coming in from like a lobbying perspective to have an NSCA professional maybe sit alongside somebody writing these contracts, or maybe have some literature available within the governing body so that when
To
that,
be fair, I think some of that did happen.
I don't see it.
Like I don't know this for sure. I wasn't there. I wasn't involved,
I heard
but I'm
from a
pretty
bird.
sure that the NSCA did play a role in advising on contract language.
That almost makes it worse then that we're in the situation that we're in, because again, I would go back to this thought process of if, and this is Drew's ideal world, if the NSCA, being the industry standard that it claims to be, could elevate the level of what it means to be a strength and conditioning professional, you could then advocate to the government to write contracts in such a way that those people can then make more money. Because if there are fewer of them, if supply is lower, demand becomes high. I mean, that's economics, like you said.
Well, I'm going to
Um,
bring you to one of the practical things you said
please.
pre-recording that I thought was pretty valuable because I can sympathize in the situation that it is hard to craft appropriate language and appropriate standards in a space where a lot of subjectivity is involved. If you if you go out into collegiate and pro and people who are getting really cool jobs, a lot of that, like you'll hear all the time, the certificate or certificates or whatever courses you've been to and credentials you have, sometimes it's a foot in the door, sometimes it's barely even that. The decisions on who's getting hired happen in a conversation and are largely influenced by personal relationships and things like that. That is a good hint that there's a ton of subjectivity in the space, and it's hard to create objectivity in this space. But you mentioned a potential method for addressing that subjectivity in a productive way, which would be some kind of board certification process.
Yes.
I think the hard part is why create additional barriers when there are already all these the passion tax issues we were just discussing already in place. And I will cite examples where we've seen this gone wrong, and maybe some of these medical professionals can come back to us with what the people in their side of this whole issue are saying is the solution. But we look at other professionals that are involved in this whole thing. The ones that come to mind: physical therapists, dietitians, athletic trainers. In my few little lenses into their industry, they're having a ton of the same problems, and they require more education and more certification to get there, and they're still not getting paid terribly well. I've seen tons of discussion of this in terms of like stagnant salaries in the physical therapist world. I know there's a lot of anger in the athletic training world about the entry level master's requirement when the pay is not commensurate with that. I've like dietitians, the one I always point to, and they use it as a recruiting line to get people to go to the like Army Baylor program and things like that, is that active duty dietitians are dramatically better paid than most civilian dietitians. I think that's probably true on the physical therapy side too, depending on the rank you're getting to and things like that. I just don't know. I don't know what the answer is. And you use doctors pre-recording as an example of people who've done a little better, but there's
Yeah.
a bunch of other factors
But
there.
I think
And
the thing with doctors is that there's a cultural um pedestal maybe
yes,
that's
100%.
happening. And that
Which
to
is the
me, that's
result of
just
like centuries of
right.
advocacy.
It's a product of time, right? And so maybe we make decisions today that centuries from now elevate the industry. But like I think you brought up the point of like why make it harder? It's like, well, to me, like, okay, what's harder? Having an industry where everybody gets paid shit, or having an industry where it's a little bit harder to get the qualification to then get paid a little bit more?
No, I
Because I
think
think the pay is
yes.
always going to lag. The pay will be a lagging function behind the caliber at which you have to perform to get the job.
Yeah, what I worry about is what we've seen with like athletic training in particular, where they raised the bar with that being the goal,
Hmm.
and then the pay didn't catch up, or at least hasn't yet.
Is that because they didn't lobby for more pay? I
I
don't know.
don't
I
know.
don't
I
know the
don't know
world.
what the answer is. I have
Yeah,
like, and hopefully there's some like smart folks listening to this who can come tell us we're being idiots and that we're
I would love that,
getting this completely wrong. But
please. Because I think what would have to happen is the NSCA would have to say, okay, fine, board certification, master's degree, whatever, all the things. And then on the back end, create a situation where the government could not, for the tactical space at least, the government could not, like, that'd be a hard one because they'd have to then create a world where the pay does go up through advocacy and maybe it's restructuring of language and it becomes an LPTA versus a lowest bidder situation.
yeah,
Because really, I mean, kind of the ugly truth that we haven't really quite yet mentioned is that the industry itself, i.e., the coaches, there's not really a mechanism of crowd control where you could just tell people to please stop accepting jobs that don't pay very much. Because to your point, there will always be somebody that will do it.
that's the problem, man. Like
Right. I mean, that's
the
economics.
yeah, like if somebody if you quit because the pay is too low and they can find somebody to replace you, why would
Hmm.
they change anything?
The only way
And
to
it's
fix it is to create a union. I mean, that's exactly what unions are for. And I know that
yeah.
becomes a politically charged thing. I live in the South, so I don't know a ton about unions, but that's why they exist. I mean, you see that happen all the time. Writers go on strike in Hollywood. Netflix has a bunch of shitty TV shows for a while, and then writers get paid more money.
Yeah.
So maybe we're advocating for a strength and conditioning union. I don't know. Are we?
I mean, it sounds kind of like it. I don't know what the answer looks like, but I'm looking at our list of like topics we're supposed to talk about here to figure out what we're missing. We've addressed a little bit the upward mobility issue, the like career opportunity. Is it a job or is it a career kind of stuff?
I still think it's
Um,
a job. I don't. It's hard to make a career out of it.
and I think I don't have the data in front of me. There's for sure an issue of in many careers or jobs or whatever you want to call it, in many fields, in many industries, there are a ton of people at the entry level, and then a select few get lucky enough or work hard enough or whatever you want to call it to like rise above into more sustainable positions. And a lot of the other ones flake off into other fields where there's more
Hmm.
career potential.
Medical device
And
sales.
yes, medical device sales being one of the ones that a lot of people that end up with anatomy training go do,
Yeah.
whatever. And I think that phenomenon is an issue in this space for sure. But like, how fixable is that? Who knows? I will also say we've mentioned it indirectly a couple times here. The NSCA does do these salary surveys and people fill them out and things like that. And
Stop
if
filling them
tact,
out.
I mean, they still provide a useful reference, right? And like we do know some things because of them. And one of those things is that tactical does pay better than other sectors. It's not the lowest one. Now, people would point out that tactical is kind of stagnant in terms of growth at the moment. Like if you
Hmm.
look at others, even if their higher level is still lower than where tactical is at, they're catching up because the growth is faster. So there's certainly a conversation there about if we don't do something, it'll fall behind, but it hasn't fallen behind yet. Other factors include, I think, the quality of life in tactical and the hours you work and things like that are almost certainly dramatically better than what even some of those lower paid folks in like D2 collegiate and things like that are dealing with. I think they're, despite contracting, have a little bit of a lack of job security. I think it's still better job security than you see in a lot of collegiate settings and things like that. There are a lot of pros to tactical that aren't just the pay, and I think part of the reason for the stagnation is there are a lot more tactical jobs closer to entry level than there were before. When tactical first launched, they were pulling reasonably experienced, reasonably competent people out of pretty high power collegiate and pro jobs to fill them. Now that there is more tactical opportunity in the conventional force and at a larger scale and things like that, these jobs still are not entry level. Like respect to the people that are filling the jobs, they do require a few years of experience, but they're closer to entry level than what was being hired at before. So if you expand the lower end of it, you see some stagnation. And just to like kind of say it out loud, I think there's a certain phenomenon of some of these conventional programs are going to serve as kind of like developmental league, farm league kind of situation where people are trying to move into special operations jobs that might pay a little bit better. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but that is a big part, in my mind at least, of why we haven't seen the same level of growth in tactical that other sectors of strength and conditioning have seen in the last few years.
Well, and I think the growth, and maybe this is a unique phenomenon for tactical strength and conditioning. I would assume the same thing doesn't exist in sort of the academic collegiate side. But with that growth you mentioned, in my perspective, comes a whole lot of risk because in order to pursue growth, you have to lower the bar to bring in more people to facilitate that growth. But then by doing that, and what we're seeing now is that the perception then from a customer standpoint, i.e., senior leaders in the military, becomes, wait a second, it's not that hard to get these kinds of jobs. We can replace these contractors with active duty folks who go and do a 2 week course, or a 3 week course, and they can serve as the human performance person because based on what we're seeing, the requirements for fulfilling these roles are relatively low. I don't, in my experience, I haven't seen that same phenomenon occur in special operations. I don't see a clamoring from special operations leadership to replace human performance professionals with active duty folks who've gone to a course. But in the conventional side of the house, because of just the scale of the thing, it seems like the product has become perceptually very cheapened, so much so that now there's this conversation about, well, what if we can just replace all of them and save a bunch of money?
I think there's some of that going on in conventional, and I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of extender courses and train the
Oh,
trainer
we have
courses
another
and
episode
whatever.
coming.
Yeah, that's a whole episode. Don't worry about it. It'll come soon. But
Stay tuned.
I I think when some of this was launched, there were a lot of senior leaders thinking, yeah, the coaches are a temporary thing while we grow our own or create this MOS or whatever it is. Um, some conditions have changed at a high level in terms of like whether the army is growing or shrinking or whether the DoD is growing or shrinking. That changes the algebra a little bit. I do think the ratio of coaches to tactical professionals in some of the programs was never sustainable in terms of what it was launched at, in terms of the amount of coaches you see in a brigade. I
You
don't
think so?
think I just don't see long term there being like two coaches per conventional battalion across the entire force. That's like if you do the math as you start to scale the program, that would be an insane growth of the field, and quality control becomes really hard and things like that. What I think would hopefully happen, and I say this from a position of privilege, not being in one of those contracting roles and not feeling threatened by it. I do think that the total number of coaches in the future will still be larger than it is today, but I think they will be spread a little thinner in terms of their ratio to the service members they support, which means they have to be better, which means there should be a higher bar for getting those positions, but there should also be a commensurate salary increase and job security increase. And that's coming back to the title of this whole thing. That's why I think we should see more federal civilian roles. Because, like we said this from the top, right? Personal services contract creates that appearance of an employer employee relationship or more of an actual employer employee relationship. And when you have that, realistically, the long term solution is actual government employees who have a little bit of stability. And at least in this industry, the pay is very competitive. I think I would love to see that as one of the longer term solutions.
There's such an aversion, though, to creating civilian positions because you
I
can't.
know, but I think if the like
I agree with
given
you.
the amount of momentum these programs are getting in terms of their ability to influence readiness, influence suicidality, influence quality of life,
Hmm.
whatever, like as that success starts to be more and more front of mind for the senior leaders who engage with Congress and have the conversations about authorizing end strength of federal civilians, I think you're equipped to justify it better now that you've proven a certain level of effectiveness early on.
I think the right model, this is Drew's model, would go something like this. You would have those civilians, well paid, tenured, whatever, protected,
Mhm.
with some miles and some experience. They would oversee embedded programs within, I'll use the Army here, embedded programs within brigades that are facilitated by active duty individuals whose MOS, whose military occupational specialty is physical training, much like what we've talked about with the British folks that have
Mhm.
come on and talked about that. So those folks would go and train.
I can tell you that there's been a lot of desire for that from senior leader levels, and it is on the back burner now for sure. And that is because there is no space. People in
But
the army will be
see,
familiar with R
that's
struck right now.
that's bullshit.
We're literally deleting battalions all over the
I
place
get
right
that.
now. There's no space to create a new MOS at the moment.
I understand that. But if we wanted to, we could.
Yeah, at the expense of something.
All of these are made up rules in a made up game. It's just, I'm sorry, it's just the way it is. So we could do that. We should. And so back to Drew's ideal world.
I think
Those,
when you're getting rid of brigade engineer battalions and cavalry squadrons and things like that, like it's very hard to argue to people at the highest level of the
but
force
here's my
to
disagreement.
prioritize this over that.
Here's my disagreement with you. And I don't know the numbers off the top of my head. You might. But when we talk about, people talk about H2F, human performance, blah, 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 blah. Why do we have this program? Well, because prior to this program, we had literally brigade-sized elements of soldiers injured and not able to fight the war, yada, yada, yada.
And I will acknowledge this is me devil's advocating and kind of
Of
agreeing
course.
with you is that we did manage to create recruiting warrant officers in the midst of a
See,
shrinking force.
when
So
you
if it
want to
is,
do something, you can.
yeah, if it is
So,
enough of a crisis, they can make it happen.
right.
Yes, it's
And
true.
so my point is, you talk about you'd have to get rid of brigades to create another thing. The zero sum thing to me
Sure.
fleshes out when we also include the fact that by putting money towards a well structured human performance element, you regain manpower to the tune of brigade sized elements. And so it nets out,
Those conversations would be a lot easier if there was a DoD level human performance proponent sitting at the
which is
Pentagon advocating for these things.
part of Drew's ideal world here. I hadn't got to that point
Yes.
yet. But from a top down perspective, what I'm looking at is this civilian role, highly paid, lucrative, all the things we talked about. And then you'd have your active duty folks going through, and that would be their MLS. And
Mhm.
then you could somehow in there have the strength and conditioning position. Maybe it's contracting, maybe not, but to kind of plus up those numbers.
Sure. And I agree with that completely. And I also think that getting way bigger picture and threatening to go down a rabbit hole, if there was an MOS doing this stuff, that I think those folks, as they separate, whether they separate
Hmm.
after a certain amount of time or whether they retire or whatever, they are in a fantastic position to help with the public health crisis America is experiencing in
What? Look at
terms of
that.
slot these people in as gym teachers, health promotion professionals,
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah.
I see. And here's the thing. All of this is doable. It's just like fast food on military installations. It's an easy fix. People just have to do it.
I don't know how close we are to finishing or
I
how
don't
much
know
more
when
we
we
have to talk
started.
about, but this is something I should have addressed much earlier in clear terms, and I will link it in the show notes and stuff like that. But just for a frame of reference on the whole pay issue, um, so overall, across the entire strength and conditioning industry, according to the NSCA, from 2018 to 2022, salaries increased by 22% on average. That is average across the industry. In tactical, they decreased by 1%. So that is the source of frustration when I say that there's a stagnation in tactical salaries. Now, despite that, tactical is still the second highest paying sector of strength and conditioning. The sectors they looked at were high school, college, professional, tactical, and independent/private. And only pro sports outperformed tactical in terms of the averages. Now, I will say there are plenty of new tactical positions that are paying below what some of these averages are in some of the other sectors, yada, yada, yada. Lots of factors to consider. But the industry is net trending up versus tactical is flat or slightly down. And
And
I don't know. I'd have to go back and read the whole report if these are adjusted for inflation or not. If they're not adjusted for inflation, that's even worse.
well, the other thing they're not adjusted for is cost of living.
Sure. And
And
that's a
that's a,
huge topic of like the
yeah,
locations coaches are in makes a huge impact. Yeah.
exactly. We didn't mention that, but it is a thing that a lot of people suffer from, which is to say that if, again, Douchebags Anonymous wins the contract and decides to pay their coaches $60,000, that applies to a coach in Seattle as much as it applies to a coach in the middle of nowhere, Louisiana.
I would say not quite though. Like that is on the company.
Yeah, that's what I'm
And
saying.
that should be structured into their
It
bid.
should.
But many of these companies do have pay differentials depending on location. And
Some of them, I know
sure,
coaches on food stamps basically because
yeah,
they don't adjust for cost of living, which is
sure.
asinine.
And that's
Um,
one that it's very hard to blame the government
sure.
because the company should have factored that in.
Let's
Yeah.
do this. To close, let's make a lot of enemies. Ready? Let's play the blame game. Why is it the government's fault?
Got to write better contracts.
Got to write better
Got to not
contracts.
leave the wiggle room that allows for the
Hmm.
shenanigans.
Okay, I'd agree with you. Why is it the contract company's fault?
If you bid knowing you're going to underpay people,
You're an asshole.
it's kind of on you.
Yep. And if you're not adjusting for cost of living, you're an asshole. Why is it the strength and conditioning coach's faults cumulatively?
There are some fantastic strength and conditioning coaches that are doing awesome work. There are some who create a perception that they are not doing very much.
Hmm.
Sorry, guys.
And there needs to be a union. Who we left off here? Why is it?
The capitalists' fault.
Why is it the NSCA's fault? It's my favorite.
I mean, you've said it before, but the advocacy
Advocacy.
just isn't what it could
Yeah,
be. Yeah.
advocacy. And again, we've said this already a couple times in the episode. For any and all of,
Can I just state a quick opinion? I want to get it on
please,
the record.
please.
Um, the NSCA is moving towards, and they have announced this publicly, with an intended implementation date of 2030, where it will no longer just be you have a bachelor's degree to sit for the CSCS. It will be you have to have a bachelor's degree from a specific program that they consider relevant enough. And I believe it has to be a program like accredited through them and things like that. I think it's a mistake. There might be things that I don't understand complicating it, but it sounds a whole lot like what the athletic training side did with the entry level masters. And I think it's going to hurt the NSCA in terms of cutting their cash flow, in terms of people coming into the field. I think it's going to hurt the field in terms of you get people that come from exactly the same background and don't have different perspectives. I know a ton of good coaches that wouldn't meet the requirements that they're going to put in 2030. I'm a huge fan of advocacy and raising the bar. And we talked about the board certification stuff and things like that. I'm a huge fan of raising the bar. I'm not a fan of doing it in a way that's going to hurt people without a clear path towards the benefits we're calling for here.
I think what you're saying is there's two ways you can elevate the game. You can make it harder to be eligible, or you can make it harder to pass,
Mm.
basically. And so what I hear from you is because I have a degree in business, you have a degree in who knows what.
International relations, baby.
Right. Neither one of us would be qualified by that account to have a CSES. Now, I think the master's in strength and conditioning for me would meet the bill, but
I don't, let me check.
it might
I
not.
think it might
It might
not.
not. But my point there is to because I agree with what you're saying, and I think the way to do it would be to anybody and everybody would be eligible, but the requirements you have to meet to graduate from that program would be harder. Hopefully that makes sense to people because it is two very different things.
Targeted to take effect beginning 2030 to be eligible to take the CSCS examination, candidates must hold a bachelor's degree from a program accredited by an NSA approved accrediting agency. This degree will have specific requirements to focus on strength and conditioning.
Yeah, and so like that's stupid. And I think they're doing it the wrong way. So I agree with
It
you.
even says
And
this change will align the CSCS with other allied healthcare professions such as athletic trainers, nurses, physical therapists, and medical doctors. Ask the physical therapists and athletic trainers how that's working out, especially the athletic trainers.
oh man, we should have someone from the NSCA on to answer these
We're
questions.
overdue to do that.
Because
And
again,
they've been friendly enough with me
yeah.
despite us like taking shots randomly.
Well, and that's the thing. Hopefully people know like Drew and Alex like to take shots, but we also love being proven wrong. So if people have information that goes against the things that we're saying, like please reach out and come on and have these conversations with us. Because as it stands right now, that sounds like a stupid idea.
Frustratingly, if you go to like the NSCA page that's announcing that change, it does say like NSCA has created a website dedicated to these changes that contains many FAQs. Please visit link to learn more. And that link is broken.
Hmm. Maybe the
Frustrating.
barrier to entry to work for the NSCA should be to have a computer science degree and know how to fix a website.
Well, I think again, why are we taking so many shots at an
I don't know.
organization we would love to be friends with? But I think knowing many
Sorry.
people who've worked for that organization, I think many of them would like to see more coaches at the headquarters because I
Hmm.
don't think there are as many coaches involved in the decision making as people might think there are.
Cool gym though.
Yeah, it's a nice gym.
Have we left any stones unturned here? Again, like we prefaced this at the top, like an ongoing discussion for sure.
I think there's a little bit of intentional shit stirring happening here to try and get the conversation going. We say I've said this to a ton of people, but what we do with Mops and Mo's is take conversations that are happening behind the scenes and bring them
Blast it
into the
out.
light where they can happen in a public space. And so I am sure there are things we got wrong in this. I am sure there are things that we're not up to date on or missed some factors or nuance and things like that. And if you are out there, man, we got to figure out how to navigate this with rule number one.
Send us an email.
If you are out there and want to correct us, fire us a note. If you are out there and want to come on the pod to defend yourself or an organization that you represent or something like that, careful not to violate rule number one, which is that we don't bring people on the podcast who ask to come on the podcast. But I will say we are very open to receiving
Sure.
recommendations for who is qualified to have that conversation. And we might even do something crazy and potentially waive rule number one for the right person with the right qualifications.
Well, and I would add to that, I would also love to hear more stories of like coaches in the trenches doing the thing who have been
Yeah.
on the wrong side of contracting as it pertains to this specific episode, but just more stories because like you said, the reason why this episode came to light was because we had heard so many things and I know that there's more out there. And so feel free to reach out, send emails, slide into the DMs, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
because truly I think for both of us, it's like it'd be really cool. We bitch about a lot of this stuff, but it would be really cool to move the needle in some regard. And I think the only way we do that is by collecting common experiences and then bringing that, like you said, to light.
I will make what Drew just said there a little bit more direct.
Send us stuff.
If you are in a position where you would like to contribute to this conversation, but you are unable to come on and speak or even attach your name to something, we would love to field and keep anonymous input from folks who have some kind of perspective on this whole issue. We can do future episodes. We can incorporate it into whatever kind of advocacy we get involved in. Who knows? But our emails are Alex and Drew, respectively, at mopsandmoes.com, mopsnmoes.com. There are form links on the website you can use to submit that way. The DMs on Instagram are open. And if it's really necessary, we can figure out a way to create like an anonymous submission process if you don't want to create like a burner account or something as well.
Well, thanks for listening and see you next week.
Bye.
Hey, Alex, let's cover our ass real quick.
Oh, great idea, Drew. All right, guys. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. Before you go, please rate and review the pod on the listening platform of your choice. You can also visit us on our website at www.mopsinmos.com. That's mops, the letter N, mos.com. You can check out the library of podcast episodes, our latest blog entries, any helpful resources, and also sign up for our newsletter.
Drew nailed it. Just to underline a couple of things, the podcast entries have in-depth show notes on the website. So if you missed anything or you want to read any of the research we talk about, it is all there. You can, at the bottom of the website, sign up with your email and receive future updates from us. The blog posts go a little bit more in depth in kind of written form on a couple of topics we get questions about all the time. But most importantly, I just want to ask all you guys, our best way the word gets out is absolutely word of mouth. So tell your friends, tell the people you work with, anybody you think would find it useful. Thanks for spreading the word.
If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot us an email at either Drew or Alex at mopsandmos.com.
Or there's a contact form on the website.